What we're going to talk about is Lincoln's inauguration and some of the things he stated after inheriting all these problems of secession. In his address, he made two things very, very clear to the American people when he gave his inaugural address. Two things that were very, very clear. The first thing he said is that secession from the Union, or breaking off from the Union, was illegal. It would not be deemed a legal action. It would be an illegal action. So, in his inaugural address, President Lincoln made it very clear that seceding or secession from the Union, leaving the Union, was illegal. The second thing he said sets the stage for civil war because of what happened. Now, what I tell you was one of the things the Confederacy did as soon as they got their government set up. They elected a president, Jefferson Davis, and what did they do next?
Arsenals.
They seized all the federal arsenals in the South. Well, the second thing that Lincoln made it really clear is all federal property, because those arsenals were technically property of the United States government, and if these people choose to secede, that's not their property. He stated that federal property that was located in the South would be held by the federal government and protected. So he made it really clear that any of those federal arsenals or federal properties, even though they were located in the South, belonged to the United States of America, not the Confederate States of America, and they would be protected at all cost. Stating bluntly that the South better not, the Confederacy, better not try to take those arsenals, because if they do, it's going to result in trouble. Which will take us to our last subtopic, which is the fall of Fort Sumter. Fall of Fort Sumter. This is going to be the event, kiddos, that takes us into Civil War. The fall of Fort, it's on your ID sheet, Sumter, S-U-M-T-E-R. Fall of Fort Sumter. Now, Lincoln was in a little bit of a pickle because that lame duck period from the time he was elected until the time he was inaugurated, which is about, December, January, February, during that time that James Buchanan served out the rest of his term, a lot of the federal property in the South had already been taken by the Confederacy. And Lincoln made it clear that they would not try to do what? All the federal arsenals were taken during the latter stages of the Buchanan presidency, and Lincoln said they would not try to what? Take it back. Whatever they lost prior to his inauguration, they lost. But he made it clear that there were two Southern Union military posts that had not been taken that they would protect at all cost. So again, after he took office, Lincoln knew that much of the federal property in the South had already been taken during the latter stages of the Buchanan administration, from the time Lincoln was elected until he took office. And he made it clear to the American people that the Union would not try to regain any property that was already taken. But he also stated there were two forts in the South that had not been taken that they would protect at any cost. One was Fort Pickens, which is on your ID sheet, that was located in Florida, and the other was Fort Sumter, which was located in South Carolina. So Lincoln made it clear that there were two Southern Union military posts that the United States of America would protect at any cost. The first one was Fort Pickens in Florida, and the second one was Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Now, Lincoln knew that they would be targets, and so he sent U.S. Navy ships to both forts with supplies. Okay? He knows they're both going to be targets, and so he sends U.S. Navy ships to both forts. What kind of forts are they? Where are they located, by the way? By the seacoast, right? And he sent Navy ships to both forts with supplies so he can protect those forts. Well, when the Confederates heard that he was sending these ships with supplies, what became their strategy? We better attack the fort before the supplies get there. Okay? So when the Confederates heard of the news of Lincoln sending Navy ships to Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens with supplies, they immediately made plans to attack the forts before those supplies had a chance to get there. Just so happened the first one they attacked was Fort Sumter. Okay? So they're going to attack these forts. They're not even get to Fort Pickens because the actions of Fort Sumter are going to take us into Civil War. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 a.m., on April 12th of 1861, the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter. I'll tell you, 4 a.m. on April 12th, 1861, the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter. 4 o'clock in the morning, on April 12th, 1861, the Confederate States of America opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Union commander in charge of Fort Sumter was Robert Anderson. The Union commander in charge of Fort Sumter was Robert Anderson. And he held out against the Confederates for 36 hours. Yep. Robert Anderson. That's why that sheet's really important, man. So Union Major Robert Anderson held out against the Confederates for 36 hours. But he was lacking supplies because they hadn't gotten there. So finally he couldn't hold out any longer and surrendered the fort to the south, marching his men out. So at 4 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the Confederate States of America opened fire on Fort Sumter. Union Major Robert Anderson held out against the Confederate attack for 36 hours. But lacking supplies, he could hold out no longer and surrendered the fort to the south and marched his men out. Now this is kind of ironic because this really will be considered the first fight in the Civil War, and it was basically a cannon fire fight, and not one man was killed on either side. It will be the only battle of the Civil War that has no casualties. Okay? So it's basically a cannon fight, and when it's over, no one on either side was killed, and it would be the last battle that would result in no casualties. We talked about the Battle of Baltimore at the War of 1812. Very few, if any, casualties in that. Why? Because they just bombed them. You know, they protected themselves and finally said, hey, we can't reach Fort McHenry, so we're just going to leave. Well, this guy here knew that if he continued to fight, I'm sure he ran out of cannonballs and everything else, his men would be killed, so he surrendered and no casualties. It would be the only fight in the Civil War where no casualties occurred. Now, President Lincoln received news of the surrender of Fort Sumter. He was very upset and he acted very quickly. He acted very quickly when he got news of the surrender of Fort Sumter. What was our army like at the time? We ever made him in it? No, not really. Okay, so the first thing Lincoln does when he hears about the events of Fort Sumter, because he's anticipating what? A war, is he asks for 75,000 volunteers to enlist in the United States Army to fight against the Confederate States of America. So the new president asks for 75,000 volunteers to enlist in the United States Army with the plans to fight against this Confederate States of America. Now, if you signed up and volunteered, it was a 90-day tour of duty. 90 days. It's a 90-day tour of duty. He asked 75,000 volunteers. He asked for 75. I need 75,000 to enlist in the United States Army. You're going to fight against the Confederate States of America, and this enlistment would be 90 days. Does that seem like a very long enlistment? No. So let's think about that. Why did Lincoln make it a 90-day enlistment? He didn't think that, he thought that it wouldn't last 90 days. They would just knock down these Confederate States of America like that, and 90 days would be more than enough. We're gonna find out later that wasn't true, obviously, because this thing goes on for 5 years, 4 or 5 years. Well, this is how patriotic people were at the time. So many men volunteered, they turned thousands away. He needed 75,000, right? So many men came forward and volunteered that thousands were turned away. Now, they certainly won't be turned away later when we get into these things, because like Zaid said, the 90-day tour wasn't realistic because it didn't last 90 days. We thought it would only last about 90 days. And we'll give you more information about that after Christmas. Now, once Lincoln had the necessary troops, once he got the 75,000 volunteers to fight against the South, he then asked Congress for a formal declaration of war against the Confederate States of America. Because who's the only person that can declare war? Congress. Okay? So once Lincoln had the necessary troops to fight against the South, he then asked Congress to formally declare war on the Confederate States of America. And Congress complied with his request, and eventually war was declared by the Union against the South. So Congress complies with his request, and the Congress declares war by the Union upon the South. Okay, what happened in Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia when that word came out? They seceded from the Union. So as soon as word of this action surfaced, listen carefully, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and part of Virginia secede from the Union. This is when we had the separation, right here, kiddos. This whole thing was Virginia at one time. The western part of Virginia did not want to secede, therefore they broke off and formed their own state that we know today as West Virginia. Did you know that? You knew we had West Virginia, did you? But the people who lived in the western part of Virginia did not want to secede. And so they broke off from the state and formed their own new state, as we know today, of West Virginia. So how many Confederate states do we have now after, how many do we have at first? 7. How many added? 4. That's 11. So the Confederate States of America at this time stand at 11 strong. Where was the capital? Montgomery, Alabama. But when these other 4 states seceded, ironically, they moved the capital city to Richmond, Virginia. Now the ironic thing about the capital, Confederate capital being moved to Richmond, Virginia, is how close is it to Washington, D.C.? The two capitals are very close together. When I take kids to Washington, D.C. for our trip, we stay at Alexandria, Virginia. Okay, so now the ironic thing about this is the Confederate capital, right, and the Union capital are very close together. Now, that didn't end things. There were 5 states that considered themselves neutral. They weren't going to support either the North or the South. They would call these states in the Civil War border states. In other words, they wouldn't commit to the North or the South. They committed to becoming neutral. They did not want to be part of this thing. Okay? I'll tell you which states those were. Okay? These were considered border states in a way, or states that were neutral. Okay? The following 5 states declared themselves neutral. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware. And knowing they didn't want to join the South, but weren't sure they wanted to join the North, West Virginia. So the 5 states that consider themselves neutral or border states were Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, West Virginia. with the sides chosen, what we will cover after Christmas will be the Civil War. Okay. What's next on the agenda? Let's have a little review. Now, this might throw you a little, but it's the way it goes. You are going to have on your test 30 multiple choice questions. You know what multiple choice questions are, yes?
Yes.
What? Arkansas, Virginia, what were they? What was the fourth one? Virginia,
North Carolina.
Okay, it was Arkansas, Tennessee,
North Carolina. Yeah. All right, you know what multiple choice questions are? I'll give you an example.
Yes, sir.
You better have good news.
Oh, boy.
I'm so excited.
Brady Salzman is
Yeah, he does.
NISN.
awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Brady Salzman is,
Illinois.
Brady Salzman is, Brady Salzman is,
I thought that said lad.
He's a good lad.
That's what I said. Okay, disco lover.
Where's all of the above?
Another F.
A, B. A is the above, D is the above. Not above.
Above.
Oh, it's at least B.
Yeah, I think just.
How far are we going?
I can't even see.
There's 26 letters, let's go all the way.
all right, no, they won't be this bad, but Brady Salzman is awesome. Brady Salzman is an OSS. Brady Salzman is a good kid. Brady Salzman is a disco lover. Brady Salzman is A and B above. Brady Salzman is D and C above. None of the above, all the above. That's kind of what. So you have to figure out what's true. Now, I'll answer this one for you. I would say this would be none of the above because I would see him as awesome in OSS and a good kid. I don't think he's a disco lover. Okay? But that's kind of how it goes. So, yes. Did you go get a drink? Okay. Explain. Oh, you didn't see this? Okay, you'll get it. All right, here's the first question. Here we go. I'm recording it in case you need to get it later. Here's the first multiple choice question. You ready? I'm not sure how you want to do it. Write on your ID sheet if you had it with you or what. Okay, here's the first question. Number one. It'll be on. Now listen to me. You can use your notes. It's going to be recorded right there. Okay, here we go. The representative that offered an amendment to Missouri's application to be admitted into the Union was, listen up, you want, I don't have to give you this review, I can just give you the notes, here we go. The representative that offered an amendment to Missouri's application to be admitted into the Union was, who was it? Who was it?
I know.
Talmadge? It was James Talmadge.
Yeah.
Now, so listen to this. Here's the question. Tell me what, here's an example of the question. The representative that offered an amendment to Missouri's application to be admitted into the Union was A, Henry Clay. No. B, James Talmadge. Yes. C, John C. Calhoun. No. D, Stephen Douglas. No. None of the above. No. Now, so when you do a multiple choice question, what are you really doing? You're doing true and false. You have to read the question to decide if the A is true or B is true, etc. So we get that one there. So I would know who James Talmadge is, for sure. Okay? It is, yeah. Okay, number 2. The Democratic congressman who opposed slavery in any of the new lands the United States acquired from Mexico was David Wilmot. That's right. So let's listen to our choices. The Democratic congressman who opposed slavery in any of the new lands in the United States acquired from Mexico was A. President James K. Polk? No. B. Stephen Douglas? No. C. John C. Calhoun? D. Lewis Cass? E. None of the above.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Now, I'm not guaranteeing this is how they'll be, but I would know who David Wilmot was, okay? Know who that guy was. Yeah. Look, I would just asterisk him so you know. You'll have to look him up in your notes, right? If you had it. Okay, here's the third one. The politician that believed the issue of slavery in any of the new lands in the United States acquired from Mexico be settled by the Missouri Compromise was who? President James K. Polk. So I would know that. The politician that believed the issue of slavery in any of the new lands in the United States acquired from Mexico be settled by the Missouri Compromise was President James K. Polk. So if I said A, President James K. Polk, yes. B, David Wilmot, no. C, John C. Calhoun, no. D, Lewis Cass, no. E, none of the above, no. These questions right now that I'm asking are one answer questions. You just got to know who the people are, right?
Slavery.
Hey, how about this? 4, the politician that believed that Congress had the right to prohibit